Emily Harper had grease under her fingernails the day the letter arrived. She had just finished tightening the bolts on a farmer's tractor engine when the postman pulled up, waving a manila envelope at her from his bicycle. Most mail that came. Her way was routine parts catalogs, utility bills, or the occasional advertisement for tools she couldn't afford but longed for. But this one was different. It had an official seal, thick paper, and her name written in neat block letters. She wiped her hands on a rag and signed for it. A farmer waiting nearby raised an eyebrow. "Look serious, Emily," he remarked. "You ain't in trouble, are you?" She shrugged, hiding her own curiosity. "Guess I'll find out." Inside the envelope was a letter from a lawyer in town. The words made her pause, then reread. She had inherited property. Not from her family, they'd passed years ago, leaving her nothing but memories and debts, but from someone she hadn't expected. The name stopped her cold. Captain Harold Green. She hadn't thought about him in years. He was the old veteran who used to stop by the garage, always asking questions about engines and machines. Most folks avoided him, said he was gruff, strange, and too quiet for comfort. But Emily remembered how his eyes softened when he spoke about planes, about the birds, as he called them. He'd linger, watching her work, sometimes offering small, precise tips. Never rude, never patronizing. Just a man who seemed to understand engines like they were living things. Now, according to the lawyer, Green had passed away, and he had left her his hangar. The news spread faster than wildfire. By the time she drove into town the next morning, whispers had turned into open laughter. At the diner, men in dusty caps leaned back in their booths, smirking. "Emily Harper inherits an airplane hangar," one of them drawled. "What's next? She builds rockets to Mars?" Another chuckled, adding, "That place is falling apart. Ain't worth more than the weeds growing through it." Even the waitress, who usually treated Emily kindly, gave her a pitying look. Emily ignored them. She ordered her coffee, sat quietly, and sipped it with steady hands. Inside, though, a storm was brewing. Why her? Green had no family, no children, no close friends anyone knew of. Why would he leave something so strange and possibly worthless to her? That afternoon, she drove out to see it for herself. The hangar stood on the edge of the abandoned airfield, 2 miles out of town. The road was cracked and overgrown, the fences sagging with rust. Her truck rattled as she pulled up, dust clouding around her tires. She killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the hulking structure. It was bigger than she remembered tall steel walls, weather-stained and pitted, with doors so wide they looked like they could swallow a barn whole. Windows high above were shattered, jagged edges glinting in the late sunlight. A faded sign that once bore the name of the airfield now hung crooked, letters nearly gone. Emily stepped out, boots crunching on gravel. The air smelled of dust and old oil. A crow perched on the roof cawed loudly, as if mocking her. The lock on the front door was rusted, but gave way with some effort. The hinges shrieked in protest. As she pushed the door open and stepped inside, the sight that greeted her was both desolate and haunting. The hangar was cavernous, shadows stretching far into the corners where sunlight didn't reach. Dust motes swirled in golden shafts of light, filtering through the broken windows. The floor was littered with old tools, broken crates, and scraps of metal. In the center, a massive oil stain spread like a dark shadow, long dried but still clinging to the concrete. Her footsteps echoed as she walked further in. Every sound her breath, the scrape of her boots, the distant creak of steel seemed amplified in the emptiness. She felt small, swallowed by the sheer size of it all. At first glance, it looked worthless. Nothing but decay and abandonment. She thought of the men laughing at the diner and almost agreed with them. Almost. but then her eyes caught something on the far wall. Pinned neatly to a corkboard were faded photographs. She walked closer, brushing cobwebs aside. Black and white. Images of planes filled the board's sleek fighters, bombers, and small training aircraft. In some of them, a younger Harold Green stood proudly beside his crew, flight jacket zipped, helmet under his arm. His smile rare but genuine. Next to the photos were yellowed clippings of newspaper articles about the war, about squadrons returning home, about pilots who never made it back. Beneath them hung a single frame containing medals, dulled by dust but unmistakably real. Emily reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the glass. The man people had called a loner, a recluse, had once lived a life of courage and camaraderie. She turned slowly, looking at the empty hangar with new eyes. Maybe it wasn't just a pile of rust and broken tools. Maybe it was something more. A monument to a man who carried his past in silence. A place where memories still lingered, waiting for someone to notice. Her throat tightened as she remembered the way Green used to watch her at the garage. He never said much, but maybe, just maybe he had seen something in her. Something others didn't. A gust of wind rattled the metal siding, breaking her thoughts. Emily shook her head and chuckled softly. She wasn't sentimental by nature, but standing there, surrounded by greens. Shadows, she felt something stirring inside her. Responsibility, curiosity, maybe even destiny. She spent hours exploring, moving through the clutter, pushing aside old crates. She found shelves stacked with manuals, tools carefully organized in boxes, and even an old workbench with notes scribbled in the margins of grease-stained paper. It was as if Green had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the hangar in shades of orange and red, Emily stood in the center of the vast space, hands on her hips. Her boots were coated in dust, her hair smelled faintly of oil, and her heart was racing with thoughts she couldn't quite pin down. The town could laugh all it wanted. She had been given this place for a reason. Maybe it was to discover something hidden. Maybe it was to carry forward a dream she didn't yet understand. Either way, Emily knew one thing. She wasn't going to sell it. Not now. Not ever. As she locked the door behind her and climbed into her truck, the hangar loomed against the fading sky like a silent guardian. She glanced at it one last time. Before driving away, headlights cutting through the darkening road. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the beginning of a journey she hadn't asked for but couldn't walk away from. The hangar wasn't just an inheritance. It was a calling. The morning after Emily's first visit to the hangar, the gossip had already thickened like smoke in a crowded room. Small towns were like that. News traveled fast, opinions even faster. By the time Emily parked her dusty pickup outside the hardware store, heads had already turned. She climbed out, a list of supplies clutched in her hand. She needed gloves, heavy-duty trash bags, and a broom to start clearing the space. The store bell jingled as she walked in, but the chatter around her didn't stop. If anything, it grew quieter, the kind of hush that prickled the back of her neck. At the counter, the clerk, Mr. Daniels, offered a thin smile. "Morning, Emily. Heard you came into some property." "Something like that," she replied, keeping her tone even. He raised an eyebrow. "The Green Hangar, huh? Lot of folks thought that place would just rot away. Guess it's yours now." "Guess so." She slid her list across the counter. "Need these?" Danielle scanned the list, whistling low. "Starting a cleanup? That'll take you months. Place is bigger than our church and twice as broken." Emily forced a smile, paid, and carried her supplies to the truck. As she loaded the bags into the bed, she overheard two men standing nearby. "Did you hear? She's actually going to try to fix it up." "Her?" She couldn't even fix my lawnmower last summer without 3 tries. That hangar's cursed. Better off letting it collapse." The men laughed, their voices carrying in the still morning air. Emily's hands clenched. Around the edge of the truck bed, she wanted to snap back, remind them that their lawnmowers, tractors, and pickup trucks had all come back to life because of her stubborn work. But she swallowed the anger, choosing silence instead. Words wouldn't change minds, not yet. Noon, she was at the diner. It was the only place in town where you could hear the truth behind the gossip, stripped of politeness. She needed to know what people were saying. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. The smell of coffee and frying bacon hung in the air. A few heads lifted. Conversation faltered, then resumed in murmurs. Emily slid into a booth, ordered a sandwich, and tried to ignore the whispers. But the voices carried. She'll waste her time. She should just sell it to McCoy's scrapyard. Can't believe old Green thought she was the right one for it. The waitress, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda, poured Emily a cup of coffee. "Don't let him get to you, honey," she said softly. "They laughed when my husband tried. To open his repair shop, too. Course, he went under 6 months later, but..." She stopped herself, realizing her attempt at comfort had landed poorly. Emily managed a small smile. "Thanks, Linda." Across the room, a man in a leather jacket snorted loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mark my words, that hangar'll swallow her alive. Place is nothing but rust and ghosts." Laughter followed. Emily sipped her coffee slowly, her jaw tight. Ghosts, she thought. Maybe that's what Green had left her, not a building, but the weight of his memories. That evening, she returned to the hangar with her new supplies. The building loomed against the darkening sky, a hulking shadow. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the echo of her boots. She set to work sweeping dust, dragging out broken crates, and bagging debris. Each scrape of the broom felt like a small defiance against the voices in town. They said she couldn't. She would show them she could. But doubt crept in. As she leaned against the broom, sweat dripping from her brow, she wondered if they were. Right, she was just one person. She didn't have the money for major repairs, let alone the skill to restore whatever Green had been working on. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't bite off more than you can chew, Em. Dream small. Work steady." But Green hadn't been a small dreamer. He had flown planes across the skies of Europe. He had stared down fear and survived. Maybe that's why he had chosen her, not because she was the most skilled, but because she was the most stubborn. A few days later, she stopped by the grocery store. Conversations hushed as she walked down the aisle. Mrs. Carter, an older woman with sharp features, shook her head. "Emily, dear, I heard about that hangar. You know, some things are best. Left alone. Harold Green, he was a strange man. Always tinkering, never speaking much. My husband says it's bad luck, taking on something he left unfinished." Emily forced a polite nod. "Appreciate the concern, Mrs. Carter." As she walked away, she heard the woman mutter, "Poor girl doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." Outside, 2 teenagers leaned against their bikes, smirking. "Hey, Emily, gonna fly us to school in your new plane?" One called. The other laughed so hard he nearly dropped his soda. Emily tightened her grip on her grocery bag. "Laugh while you can," she muttered under her breath. "One day you'll see." Nights in the hangar became her refuge. By lantern light, she scrubbed oil stains and sorted through old boxes. She discovered spare parts wrapped in newspaper, journals filled with diagrams, and letters never sent. Each item deepened her connection to Green, each discovery reminding her that this place had once been alive with purpose. But when exhaustion hit, doubt returned. She would sit on the cold floor, staring at the vast emptiness, hearing the echoes of the town's ridicule in her mind. What if they're right? What if I'm wasting my life on a dream that isn't mine? The loneliness pressed in, heavy and suffocating. But then she would remember Green's quiet eyes watching her work, the respect in his silence. He had believed in her when no one else had. That was enough to keep her moving. The turning point came one Saturday morning. Emily had gone to the feed store for bolts when she overheard two men talking near the counter. "Shame about Green's hangar," one said. "Not really," the other replied. That place was a joke. Always thought he'd lost his mind, tinkering in there. And now that girl's wasting her time with it. Foolishness runs deep, I guess. Something inside Emily snapped. She stepped forward, her voice steady but sharp. "Funny thing about fools," she said. "They're usually the ones who finish what the cowards never started." The room fell silent. The men stared at her, mouths open. She paid for her bolts and walked out, head high. The laughter might not have stopped, but for the first time, she felt its weight lift. She didn't care anymore. Their doubts weren't hers. That night, back in the hangar, Emily set down her broom and looked around at the space slowly taking shape. The floor was cleaner, the tools organized, the walls less suffocating with clutter. It was still a long way from whole, but it was new. Longer attuned. She sat on a crate, the cool air brushing her face. For the first time, she smiled. Let them laugh. Let them doubt. She had inherited more than rust and steel. She had inherited a challenge, and she intended to meet it head-on. The town's ridicule had lit a fire in her, and that fire would not go out. Not until the hangar lived again. The rain came 2 nights later, hard and steady, drumming against the metal roof of the hangar. Emily sat inside, lantern light flickering over her makeshift workstation. She'd been sorting through boxes for hours, uncovering old tools, bolts, and scraps that seemed useless. But something in her gut told her to keep digging. Green hadn't been careless. If he left this place to her, there had to be more than dust and memories. Her hands brushed against a wooden crate shoved into the far corner, half hidden under a tarp. The lid creaked as she pried it open, the smell of mothballs and old paper filling the air. Inside was a trunk, the kind soldiers carried overseas. Dark green, dented, with brass hinges tarnished by time. Emily dragged it into the lanterns. Glow. The lock was rusted, but with a screwdriver and some persistence, it snapped open. What she found inside stopped her cold. Neatly folded inside were uniforms faded olive drab, carefully preserved. On top lay a leather flight jacket, its patches cracked but still vibrant. A pair of wings, a squadron insignia, and a name stitched. In careful thread, CPTH Green. Beneath the jacket were stacks of journals bound in dark leather, their pages yellowed but intact. Emily picked one up, flipping it open. The handwriting was precise, disciplined, the words clipped but heavy, with meaning. April 18th, 1944. Squadron lost 2 birds today. Johnson didn't make it back. It's the waiting that kills you. Sitting in the cockpit, praying the engine holds, watching the sky for shadows that mean death. We fly again tomorrow. Emily's throat tightened. She turned another page. May 12th, 1944. Shot down a Messerschmitt. Should feel proud. Instead, I see the boy's face every time I close my eyes. He was just a kid, like me. War is loud in the day, but it's the silence at night that eats at you. She closed the journal, her hands trembling. She had grown up hearing stories of the war, but here was the unfiltered truth raw, human, written by the man everyone in town had dismissed as odd. Green wasn't strange. He was scarred. At the bottom of the trunk lay a stack of black and white photographs. Emily spread them across the workbench. There was Green, younger, leaner, with sharp eyes and a faint smile that rarely reached his mouth. In some, he stood beside sleek fighter planes, helmet tucked under his arm. In others, he posed with crewmates, men with cocky grins, cigarettes dangling, arms slung over each other's shoulders. On the back of one photo, written in faint pencil, were the words, "For those who never came home." Emily stared at it for a long time, her chest tightening. She could almost hear the laughter of those young men echoing in the hangar, ghosts frozen in silver nitrate. And then she noticed something else. Beneath the photographs, carefully rolled and tied with twine, were blueprints. She unrolled them. Across the floor, they depicted the frame of a plane, every bolt, every rivet, every engine component detailed in precise ink. In the margins, Green had scribbled notes, some faded, others still sharp. Replace manifold, test landing gear, engine block check seals. Her heart thudded. This wasn't just a hobby. Green had been in the middle of a restoration project. He hadn't been tinkering aimlessly. He had a plan, one that seemed almost finished. But why had he stopped? Emily flipped open another journal, this one dated decades later. July 3rd, 1989. The warplane waits. I patch it piece by piece, but my hands grow slower. My neighbors laugh. Let them. They don't hear the silence I do. They don't feel the weight of promises unkept. Someday, someone will finish this work. Someone who understands machines, not just as parts, but as living things. Emily froze. The words seemed to leap from the page. Someday, someone will finish this work. She whispered aloud. He meant me. It was absurd. She wasn't a pilot, wasn't a historian. She was just a mechanic with grease under her nails and bills. She barely paid on time, but Green hadn't chosen anyone else. He hadn't left the hangar to the town, or to strangers. He'd chosen her. She folded the journals carefully, placed the photographs back in their bundle, and rested the jacket across her lap. For a moment, she just sat there, the storm outside rattling the walls, the lantern flickering. The jacket smelled faintly of leather and dust, but beneath that was something else, engine oil, faint but familiar. It was the scent of work, of persistence, of a man who had poured his soul into machines because they were the only things he could still control. Emily felt her chest tighten. Green hadn't been a ghost haunting the hangar. He had been waiting. The next morning, she returned to town, clutching one of the photographs. At the diner, the usual crowd of men sipped their coffee, ready to pounce on her with jokes. But before they could, she placed the photo on their table. It showed Green with his squadron, their faces young and fierce. You think he was just some old fool tinkering in a shed? She said, her voice steady. This is the man you laughed at. He flew missions so you could sit here drinking coffee. The men fell silent, their smirks fading. One of them muttered, "Didn't know he fought like that." "You didn't care to know," Emily snapped. She picked up the photo and walked out, her boots striking hard against the floor. Outside, her hands trembled not from fear, but from adrenaline. For the first time, she wasn't just defending herself. She was defending Green. Back at the hangar, she unrolled the blueprints again, tracing the lines with her fingers. She imagined Green hunched over them, his hands steady even as his body aged. He hadn't given up. He had worked until he no longer could. And now the responsibility had passed to her. Emily ran a hand through her hair and laughed softly, the sound tinged with disbelief. "What are you doing, old man? Leaving this to me?" Her laughter faded into determination. Green's story wasn't over. His journals, his photographs, his blueprints, they were all chapters left unfinished. She would finish them. She stood in the center of the hangar, the rain outside fading into silence. Around her, The shadows seemed less oppressive, the vast emptiness less daunting. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in the space. She felt him there, his presence woven into every corner, every scrap of metal, every word in his journals. Harold Green wasn't just a veteran. He was a man with dreams that had outlived him. And Emily was now the keeper of that dream. That night, as she closed the trunk and draped Green's jacket over a chair, Emily whispered, "I'll finish it. I don't know how or when, but I'll finish it." The words echoed in the vast hangar, swallowed by shadows, but for the first time, she believed them. Green's story had become hers. The hangar had already begun to feel different. In the weeks since Emily discovered Green's journals and photographs, the cavernous space no longer echoed with emptiness. Now it hummed with purpose. She had swept the floors, cleared debris, and organized tools into neat rows. Every night after closing her garage job, she returned here with lanterns and coffee, working until exhaustion dragged her home. Still, one question gnawed at her. If Green had been restoring a plane, where was it? The blueprints were clear, the notes specific. He hadn't only dreamed of it, he had worked on it. Somewhere in this hangar, a piece of that dream was waiting. One Saturday morning, she decided to search in earnest. The sunlight poured through the broken windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. Emily tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and began dragging crates and tarps toward the center. Hours passed. She uncovered old tires, rusted fuel drums, and boxes of corroded screws. Sweat dampened her shirt. Dirt smeared across her face. Every discovery was underwhelming, just more clutter. Frustration built in her chest. She slumped against a crate, gulping water from a flask. "Where are you, old man?" she muttered, glancing toward Green's jacket draped over a chair. "You didn't leave me all this for nothing." As if in answer, her eyes drifted toward the farthest corner of the hangar, the darkest part where the light barely reached. There, beneath several heavy tarps, something large created an uneven silhouette. She had noticed it before, but dismissed. It has piles of scrap. This time, her gut told her otherwise. Emily stood, determination rekindled. She grabbed the corner of the tarp and pulled. Dust exploded into the air, making her cough. She yanked harder, the fabric sliding free with a heavy rustle. Another tarp, then another, until the shape beneath began to reveal itself. Her heart skipped. It wasn't scrap. It was a frame. Long wings stretched across the floor, skeletal but unmistakable. The fuselage stood proud, its metal ribs exposed but intact. The tail fin rose like a sentinel. Even stripped bare, the lines of the craft radiated grace and strength. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the tarp and stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out. Her fingers brushed cold steel, rough with age but still solid. The touch sent a shiver up her arm. It was a warbird. Not just any plane, but something rare. She recognized the shape from Green's blueprints, an authentic World War II fighter, the kind that had roared across European skies. Here it stood, sleeping under tarps for decades, waiting for someone to wake it. She circled it slowly, awe in her every step. The wings bore faint markings, faded paint that hinted at military insignia. The cockpit glass was missing, but the frame remained, wires dangling like veins in an unfinished body. Around the aircraft lay boxes labeled with neat handwriting: engine components, hydraulics, control systems. Green hadn't been fantasizing. He had been building. Piece by piece, he had gathered the bones of this machine, assembling them with the care of a man sculpting memory itself. Emily's eyes blurred as realization sank in. This wasn't just his project, it was his life's final mission. She climbed onto a step stool and peered into the cockpit. The seat was stripped, the dashboard incomplete, but she could almost picture Green there, hunched over, tools in hand, whispering to the plane like an old friend. Her chest tightened. She could feel his presence more strongly than ever, as if he'd been guiding her to this very moment. The next few days were a blur of activity. Emily devoted every spare moment to clearing the space around the plane. She scrubbed floors, polished metal, and carefully sorted parts according to Green's notes. Each piece felt sacred, as though she were touching fragments of history. At night, she spread the blueprints across the workbench, tracing the lines with a flashlight, memorizing every detail. She studied Green's scribbled instructions, deciphering his shorthand. The more she read, the more she understood. Green had been meticulous. He had left a roadmap for her, step by step. But alongside all came fear. Could she really do this? Restoring a tractor was one thing. Rebuilding a warplane was another. The complexity was staggering. She would need resources, knowledge, maybe even help. The thought of asking for help twisted her stomach. The townsfolk still laughed, still doubted her. But as she stood before the skeletal wings each night, she realized that the laughter no longer mattered. What mattered was Green's dream and the weight of his trust. One evening, she invited her closest friend, Clara, to see the discovery. Clara was a schoolteacher, practical but supportive, and the only one who had never joined in the town's mockery. When Clara stepped inside the hangar and saw the aircraft, her jaw dropped. "Emily, this is incredible." "Yeah," Emily whispered, running a hand along the frame. "He was working on it all these years, hiding it from everyone." Clara circled the plane, eyes wide. "Do you realize what this is worth? Not just in money, but in history? People would drive hundreds of miles to see this." Emily smiled faintly. "It's not about money. He wanted it finished. That was his last wish. I can feel it." Clara studied her, then nodded slowly. "And you're going to do it, aren't you?" Emily met her gaze. "I don't have a choice." The more time Emily spent with the plane, the more it consumed her thoughts. She dreamed of engines roaring, of propellers spinning, of skies tearing open with thunder. She dreamed of Green, young again, smiling faintly as he climbed into the cockpit. The hangar became her second home. Every evening, lantern light illuminated her bent figure as she polished parts, sketched notes, and whispered encouragement to the sleeping warbird. Yet, progress was slow. The frame was solid, but much was missing. Some parts were beyond repair. She would need replacements, rare and expensive. Doubt clawed at her again, but each time it rose, she heard Green's words in her head. Someday, someone will finish this work. She refused to let him down. One night, as she sat reading another of his journals, she found an entry dated only a few years before his death. September 14th, 2012. "My hands shake too much now. The bird waits unfinished. Maybe it always will. But perhaps that's not for me to decide. Maybe it belongs to someone who still hears the sky calling. If so, I hope they find her. I hope they finish what I could not." Emily closed the journal, her eyes stinging. She pressed her palm against the warbird's frame, whispering, "I found her, Captain. I found her." In that moment, the ridicule of the town seemed distant, irrelevant. She had uncovered the true treasure of the hangar, not just the aircraft, but the unfinished legacy of a man who had lived with courage and silence. And now, his silence was hers to break. That night, Emily locked the hangar and stepped outside. The moon hung low, casting silver light across the cracked runway. She imagined the warbird soaring again, its engine thundering across the sky, carrying Green's spirit with it. Her chest filled with resolve. The journey would be long. It would be grueling, but she would not stop. The hidden treasure was no longer hidden, and Emily Harper was ready to bring it back to life. The discovery of the warbird changed everything. For days, Emily couldn't shake the image of its skeletal frame standing tall in the hangar. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw its wings stretching toward the sky, not as rusted bones, but whole, alive, and soaring. The vision burned in her chest like fire, demanding to be answered. Yet, with the fire came fear. One evening, sitting at her kitchen table with Green's journals spread before her, Emily dropped her head into her hands. She had spent hours poring over technical diagrams, lists of parts, and maintenance schedules Green had meticulously logged. The complexity of it all was staggering. "This isn't rebuilding a carburetor," she whispered to herself. "This is aviation. Military aviation." The journals didn't just speak of bolts and rivets. They spoke of hydraulics, avionics, aerodynamics, systems Emily had only skimmed in manuals. She was a skilled mechanic, but her world had been cars and trucks. A warplane was a beast of another order entirely. A voice in her mind, an echo of the townsfolk, sneered, "She's out of her depth. She embarrass herself." Emily clenched her fists. She had heard that tone her whole life, from doubting classmates to skeptical customers. Still, hearing it in her own mind cut deeper than all the jeers at the diner. She pushed the journals away and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "Why me, Green?" she muttered. "Why not leave this to someone who actually knew planes?" But then, as if in response, her gaze drifted to the photograph pinned above her counter. It was Green, much younger, standing proudly beside a plane in his uniform. He wasn't smiling. He never really did. But there was pride in his posture, certainty in his stance. Emily remembered his visits to the garage, how he would linger in the doorway, watching her work, nodding silently, as if approving each twist of her wrench. He had never doubted her. Not once. That memory tugged at something inside her, something stronger than fear. The following day, Emily returned to the hangar determined to push past the doubt. She climbed onto the frame, perched herself in the hollow cockpit, and placed her hands on the cold metal dashboard. "This is crazy," she whispered. "But maybe it's my kind of crazy." The smell of oil and rust filled her lungs. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant creak of metal shifting as the wind rattled the hangar walls. Sitting there, she could almost feel Green beside her, murmuring instructions, steadying her trembling hands. And suddenly, she knew. The decision wasn't about skill. It wasn't about money, or reputation, or even possibility. It was about promise. Green hadn't left the hangar to her by accident. He had trusted her grit, not her expertise. He had seen in her the one thing necessary to finish what he started, an unwillingness to quit, no matter how hard the road became. Emily slid off the frame and marched to the workbench. She flipped open a fresh notebook and scrawled across the first page in bold letters, Project Warhawk Completion. It wasn't just a project anymore. It was a vow. That night, Clara stopped by with coffee. She found Emily hunched over a mountain of diagrams, her hair in disarray, grease still smudged on her cheeks. "You've been at it all day, haven't you?" Clara asked gently. Emily nodded, barely glancing up. "I've decided. I'm going to finish the plane." Clara's brows rose. "That's not just tinkering, That's massive. Do you know how hard it's going to be?" Emily met her friend's eyes. There was fear in her own, yes, but also an unshakable resolve. "I know, but Green wanted this. He left it to me for a reason. I can't walk away now." Clara studied her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Then I guess I'll be your first volunteer. I don't know a wrench from a socket, but I can at least sweep floors." For the first time all day, Emily laughed. "Deal." The next week marked the true beginning. Emily created a routine. Mornings at the garage, evenings in the hangar. She cataloged every part Green had left, cross-referenced them with the blueprints, and made lists of what was missing. Some items were common enough: nuts, bolts, tubing. Others were rarer, pieces of history locked away in collections or warehouses. The enormity of the task might have crushed her spirit if not for the journals. Green's words were like a guiding hand. His meticulous notes laid out not only the mechanical process, but the heart behind it, the patience, the reverence. Each time she felt overwhelmed, she opened a journal and read his entries about fallen comrades, about duty, about carrying memory forward. "This isn't just about steel and rivets," she murmured one evening, tracing the faded ink with her fingertip. "It's about giving him peace." Still, the town wasn't kind. At the grocery store, she overheard whispers. "She's really trying to fix that old hunk of junk?" At the diner, one man chuckled. "If she gets that thing airborne, I'll eat my hat." Emily pretended not to care, but each word stung. Late at night, lying awake in her small house, the doubts crept back in. But then she would remember the day she found the plane, the awe that had filled her, the electricity that shot through her when she touched its frame. That feeling was her anchor. It reminded her that this wasn't about them. It was about Green, and about herself. For once in her life, she wasn't just repairing what was broken. She was building something greater than herself. One evening, as Emily sat cross-legged on the hangar floor surrounded by tools, she pulled out Green's dog tags from the trunk. They were scratched, worn, but still heavy with meaning. She looped them around her neck. "All right, Captain," she whispered, clutching them in her fist. "We're in this together. I'll finish it, no matter how long it takes." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, she swore she felt a warmth settle over her shoulders, as if unseen hands had rested there in approval. From that night forward, Emily was transformed. The doubts didn't vanish, but they no longer held power over her. Each setback became fuel. Each challenge became proof of her determination. When bolts refused to loosen, she worked until her knuckles bled. When the blueprints baffled her, she researched late into the night, scouring aviation, forums and manuals. And little by little, progress began. The warbird no longer looked abandoned. Polished panels reflected light. The cockpit began to take shape. The hangar, once dusty and silent, now throbbed with energy. Tools clattering, lanterns glowing, music faintly playing from an old radio. Emily had chosen. She would finish the warbird, not for pride, not to silence the town, but because a man who had carried history in his bones had believed in her enough to leave her his life's unfinished dream. And Emily Harper was not going to let him down. By the end of the month, she stood at the hangar door, sweat streaking. Her face, hands on her hips as she gazed at the plane's gleaming skeleton. It was far from done. But for the first time, it looked less like a relic and more like a promise. And Emily had already made hers. For weeks, Emily labored alone. Every evening, after a long day at the garage, she drove to the hangar with her thermos of coffee, locked the groaning doors behind her, and immersed herself in the rhythm of work. The scrape of wrenches, the creak of old metal, the clink of bolts against tin trays. These became her music. The warbird was slowly coming back to life. But the work was endless. Some nights she went home with her hands bleeding from stripped screws. Other nights she fell asleep sitting upright in the cockpit, lantern flickering beside her. She never complained, but the exhaustion weighed heavier each day. And then, one evening, the first knock came. Emily was tightening rivets when she heard it, 3 solid raps against the hangar door. She froze, startled. Nobody ever came out here. "Hello?" A voice called, muffled but firm. Emily hesitated, then wiped her hands on a rag and slid the door open. An older man stood outside, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes sharp. He wore a grease-stained cap and carried a toolbox that looked older than she was. "Name's Walter," he said. "Heard you found Green's bird." Emily blinked, unsure how to respond. "Word travels fast, huh? Always does in this town." He looked past her into the hangar, and when his gaze landed on the warbird, something flickered in his eyes. Respect, maybe even longing. Used to work on planes back in the service. "Don't do much now, but..." He tapped the toolbox. "Figured you could use a hand." Emily's throat tightened. She'd grown so used to ridicule that the offer caught her off guard. "Why?" she asked cautiously. Walter shrugged. "Because Green was a good man. And because no one should try to raise a bird like that alone." For the first time in weeks, Emily smiled. "Then come on in." Walter wasn't the last. 2 days later, another visitor appeared, a retired pilot named Frank who had flown cargo planes in Vietnam. He carried nothing but stories at first, standing in the hangar doorway with arms crossed, watching Emily and Walter work. "You know," Frank finally said, "planes aren't just machines. They've got temperaments. You treat 'em wrong, they let you know real quick." Emily chuckled. "Sounds like some trucks I've worked on." "Same principle," Frank said with a grin. "Mind if I stick around? Haven't smelled aviation grease in years." And so he stayed, leaning against crates, sharing anecdotes that made the restoration feel less like mechanical drudgery and more like breathing life into an old soul. Word spread slowly but surely. One Saturday, a group of teenagers biked out to the hangar, curiosity shining in their eyes. They lingered at the door until Emily waved them in. "What is it?" one asked, gawking at the skeletal frame. "A World War II fighter," Emily replied. "Green's project. I'm finishing it." The teens exchanged excited glances. "Can we help?" Emily hesitated. They were young, clumsy, and the warbird wasn't a toy. But then she saw their eagerness, the way they craned their necks to study the wings. She remembered being young herself, hungry to prove she could handle a wrench. "Sure," she said finally, "but no touching the engine. You can start by sweeping." They groaned but obeyed, and soon laughter echoed through the hangar alongside the scrape of brooms. The transformation was subtle but steady. The hangar, once quiet and lonely, began to buzz with voices. Walter tinkered with carburetors, Frank recounted battles with temperamental engines, and the teens competed to see who could polish panels the fastest. Clara brought sandwiches and lemonade, fussing over everyone like a mother hen. Evenings that had once stretched into solitary hours now passed in a blur of camaraderie. Emily found herself smiling more. She had always been strong alone, but now she realized there was a different kind of strength in letting others share the burden. Still, not everyone was convinced. At the diner, the laughter continued. "Can you believe it?" One man snorted between bites of pie. "She's turned that hangar into a playground. Kids and old-timers crawling all over junk metal like it's the Smithsonian." Another chuckled. "Give it a month. She quit like the rest of them would." But sometimes, Emily noticed, the voices weren't as loud as before. Sometimes, when Walter or Frank entered the diner, the mockery grew quiet. Respect for veterans ran deep, even here. And now, those veterans had chosen to stand with her. It didn't silence the ridicule completely, but it began to change the tone. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hangar in gold, Emily stepped back from the warbird and took it all in. Walter knelt by the landing gear, grease on his hands. Frank sat on a crate, explaining lift and drag to the teenagers who listened with wide eyes. Clara hummed as she stacked sandwiches on a table. The hangar was alive. For the first time since inheriting it, Emily felt she wasn't just finishing Green's project. She was building a community around it. People who once dismissed her now shared in the labor, driven by curiosity, respect, or simple companionship. And Green, she thought, would have liked this. He had carried his memories alone, but now his dream was no longer solitary. It belonged to all of them. One night, after everyone had gone home, Emily lingered in the cockpit. She ran her hand over the dashboard, the cool metal beneath her fingers. Green's dog tags rested against her chest, warm from her skin. "Looks like we've got ourselves a crew, Captain," she whispered with a smile. In the silence that followed, she felt something stir in her chest pride, belonging, maybe even hope. She wasn't alone anymore, and that changed everything. The weeks rolled on, each one carrying more progress. Panels were fitted, bolts tightened, systems cleaned. The Warbird began to resemble not just a relic, but a machine preparing to live again. Emily kept her vow close to her heart. She would finish it. But now, she realized, it wasn't only her vow. It was Walter's, Frank's, Clara's, even the teenagers. Together, they had woven themselves into Green's story, each adding a stitch to the tapestry of his legacy. The hangar had become something no one in town could ignore. Not a tomb for rusted dreams, but a cradle for rebirth. That night, as Emily locked the doors and glanced back at the silhouette of the Warbird, resting in lantern light, she whispered to herself, "We're getting closer, Green. Closer every day." The laughter of doubters still echoed in town, but inside the hangar, another sound was rising louder. The hum of determination, the murmur of hands joined in purpose. And Emily knew deep in her bones that this unlikely band of helpers was just the beginning. The Warbird would fly again. And when it did, it would carry not only Green's dream, but the spirit of everyone who had dared to believe. The day dawned with a quiet stillness. Emily woke before the alarm, her stomach tight with nerves. For months, every sunrise had been another step toward this moment. Hours of sweat, nights of aching muscles, weekends swallowed by rivets and grease. And now, the Warbird stood ready. She dressed in work clothes she didn't mind ruining, tied her hair back, and lingered for a moment at the mirror. The dog tags around her neck gleamed faintly in the early light. She touched them with steady fingers. "Today's the day, Captain," she whispered. Outside, the sky was streaked with soft hues of gold and lavender, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. When Emily arrived at the hangar, the others were already there. Walter had brought his battered toolbox. Frank leaned against a crate with his ever-present coffee thermos, and Clara busied herself arranging sandwiches and water bottles on a folding table. The teenagers swarmed with excitement, sweeping the floor for the 100th time, though it no longer needed sweeping. The Warbird gleamed in the center of the hangar like a jewel. Polished panels reflected the morning light. The cockpit canopy, restored and shining, sat proudly in place. The engine, rebuilt with care, waited like a heart ready to beat again. Emily paused in the doorway, overcome. For so long, this sight had lived only in her imagination. Now it stood before her, real, tangible, and alive. "She's beautiful," Walter said, following her gaze. His gruff voice softened. "Didn't think I'd live to see one of these old birds ready to fly again?" Frank let out a low whistle. If Green could see her now, he trailed off, his eyes glistening. Emily swallowed hard. She didn't need to imagine what Green would think. She felt it, deep in her chest, as if his presence had filled every bolt and panel of the plane. Word had spread farther than Emily realized. By mid-morning, cars lined the edge of the field outside the hangar. Families, veterans, skeptics, and curious onlookers gathered, murmuring among themselves as they peered at the restored Warbird. The same townsfolk who had once laughed now craned their necks for a better view. The laughter had gone quiet. Emily stood beside the plane, her hands greasy, her face streaked with dirt, and felt their eyes on her. Doubt fluttered in her stomach, but she stood taller. Clara approached, squeezing her shoulder. "They're here to see her, Em, and to see you. Don't let them shake you." Emily nodded, though her pulse thundered. The preparations began. Walter checked the landing gear one last time, muttering to himself as he tested the hydraulics. Frank climbed into the cockpit, flipping switches with practiced ease, explaining each step to Emily as she hovered nearby. The teenagers ferried tools back and forth, their energy buzzing through the hangar. Finally, Emily climbed into the cockpit. Her hands shook as she settled into the seat, the leather cool against her back. She ran her fingers across the dashboard, every dial and switch a testament to months of labor. Her breath came shallow. "All right, Green," she whispered, clutching the dog tags. "Be with me now." She turned the key. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, with a cough and sputter, the engine roared to life. The sound thundered through the hangar, reverberating in Emily's chest. The crowd outside gasped, then cheered. Walter pumped a fist into the air, and Frank slapped the side of the fuselage with a grin. Emily grinned through tears. "She's alive." They pushed the warbird out of the hangar, its wheels rumbling across the cracked concrete. The morning sun bathed it in gold, wings glinting like steel feathers. The crowd parted, awe etched into their faces as the relic of history rolled past them. The runway stretched ahead, weathered but still sturdy enough for one last purpose. Emily's hands tightened on the controls. This was it. Walter climbed the ladder to the cockpit, his eyes serious. "You sure about this? First flights are tricky. We can always wait for a test pilot." Emily shook her head. "No, this isn't about waiting. Green wanted her to fly again. I'm finishing what he started." Walter studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, then bring her back safe." Emily taxied the warbird to the start of the runway. The crowd hushed, holding their breath as the engine's growl filled the air. She glanced at the photo, taped beside the dash green in uniform, standing proud beside his plane. She placed her hand over the dog tags at her chest. "Let's do this," she whispered. She pushed the throttle forward. The warbird lunged, wheels rattling across the concrete. The roar of the engine drowned out everything else. The runway rushed beneath her, the crowd a blur in the corner of her vision. And then the wheels lifted. The ground fell away. The warbird soared. Cheers erupted below as the plane climbed into the sky. Emily's heart pounded, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, fear threatened to overwhelm her. What if something failed? What if she couldn't control it? But then the warbird steadied, its wings slicing cleanly through the air, responding to her touch like it had been waiting for her all along. Emily laughed, exhilaration bursting from her chest. "We're flying, Green. We're really flying." The plane banked, gracefully, sunlight flashing across its polished panels. It looped over the town, casting a shadow that made children point and veterans wipe tears from their eyes. On the ground, silence fell. The skeptics who had once mocked stood with mouths open, watching in awe as the warbird roared across the sky. It was no longer a relic. It was alive. Emily guided the plane higher, the horizon stretching endlessly before her. Wind whipped against the canopy, the engine's thunder merging with the rush of her heartbeat. For the first time in her life, she felt weightless, not just in body, but in spirit. And in that vast sky, she felt Green beside her. She could almost see him in the seat next to her, young and strong, eyes focused, lips curved in the faint smile he rarely showed. His voice seemed to whisper in her ear, steady and proud. "You did it." Tears blurred her vision, but she kept flying, circling the town in wide arcs. Every pass was a message, every roar of the engine a declaration. Green's dream had been fulfilled. When Emily finally guided the warbird back toward the runway, the crowd erupted again. She eased the plane down, wheels touching the concrete with a screech before rolling to a smooth stop. The moment the engine cut, silence fell in awed, reverent silence. Then came the applause. It rolled across the field like thunder, voices shouting, hands clapping, feet stomping. Children cheered, veterans saluted, and even the doubters wiped their eyes. Emily climbed from the cockpit, her legs trembling. Clara rushed forward, pulling her into a fierce hug. Walter clapped her on the back, pride shining in his eyes. Frank saluted with a trembling hand. "You did it, kid," he said softly. "You?" Brought her back. Emily's gaze swept the crowd. For once, there were no sneers, no laughter, only respect. And somewhere in the wind, she swore she heard Green's voice one last time. "Thank you." As the sun dipped lower, casting the warbird in a halo of orange light, Emily stood with the others, watching as the crowd filed past to glimpse the plane up close. She touched the dog tags around her neck, heart swelling. The warbird had flown. Again. And with it, Green's spirit and hers had found peace. The warbird's first flight lingered in the town's memory like a spark that refused to fade. For weeks afterward, conversations at the diner and the grocery store revolved, not around gossip or politics, but around the moment Emily Harper had lifted Green's bird into the sky. They said it was impossible. One man muttered over his morning coffee. "And yet, she did it," his companion replied, shaking his head in wonder. Even the skeptics had fallen silent. The laughter that once followed Emily had dissolved into something new: respect, awe, and in some cases, shame. For Emily, though, the applause had been only the beginning. In the days after the flight, she returned to the hangar every morning and evening. Not because the work was finished, but because she knew Green's dream had never been just about flying once. He had wanted something more permanent, a way to keep alive the memory of those who never came home. Emily stood in the hangar one quiet morning, sunlight filtering through cracked windows, dust swirling in golden beams. The warbird rested in the center, proud and gleaming, no longer a relic hidden beneath tarps, but a monument in its own right. She touched the polished wingtip, her voice low. "This isn't the end, Captain. It's just the beginning." And with that, she made her decision. The hangar would become more than a workshop. It would become a place of remembrance. The idea spread quickly. Clara, ever practical, suggested a museum. Walter insisted they needed plaques and photos. Frank volunteered to give talks, his stories carrying the weight of decades. Even the teenagers chimed in, eager to help design flyers and websites. Together, they began transforming the hangar. One corner became a display for Green's journals, photographs, and medals. Clara arranged them behind glass donated by the school. Walter crafted wooden stands for the smaller artifacts, his calloused hands surprisingly delicate with each cut. Frank provided context for every photograph, ensuring visitors would understand not just what they saw, but why it mattered. Emily poured herself into the project. Between shifts at the garage, she scrubbed floors, painted walls, and hung banners. The old hangar, once mocked as useless, blossomed into something vibrant, a bridge between past and present. The town's first open day arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon. Cars lined the road, stretching farther than Emily had imagined possible. Families filed in, their children tugging at their hands, eyes wide with curiosity. Veterans in uniform. Jackets arrived quietly, their steps slower, but their salutes sharp. Teachers brought students, eager to connect lessons to something real. Inside, the hangar buzzed with voices. People gathered around Green's journals, reading his words with hushed reverence. Children pressed their noses to the glass, marveling at metals that once seemed like objects from another world. Walter explained engine parts to fascinated teenagers, while Frank's stories held listeners spellbound. And in the center, the warbird gleamed, wings stretching proudly as if aware of the role it now played. Emily stood near the cockpit, answering questions, shaking hands, and trying not to cry. At one point, an elderly woman approached her, clutching a faded photograph. "My brother flew in one of these," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "He never came home. Thank you for giving us this." Emily's throat tightened. She took the woman's hands gently. "This isn't just my work. It's Green's. It's all of theirs. This is for them." The woman nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. From that day forward, the hangar became a cornerstone of the town. School buses arrived regularly, children listening wide-eyed as Emily explained how Green had dreamed of finishing the warbird, and how the community had come together to make it happen. Veterans came often, sometimes standing silently before the plane, sometimes sharing stories that left even the rowdiest students speechless. The laughter that once followed Emily had been replaced by greetings of gratitude. People stopped her in the street to thank her, to ask about the hangar, to offer donations of artifacts from their own families. For the first time in her life, Emily wasn't just tolerated as the female mechanic. She was embraced as the steward of history, the woman who had given wings to a veteran's last wish. But Emily herself never sought the spotlight. Most nights, after the visitors had gone and the hangar fell silent again, she lingered by the warbird, running her hands along its cool panels. She spoke to Green as if he were still there, updating him on the day's events, the children's questions, the veterans' tears. "Your dream lives on, Captain," she whispered once, the dog tags warm against her chest. "And I'll guard it for as long as I can." In those moments, she didn't feel alone. The hangar seemed to breathe. Around her, filled with echoes of voices past and present, woven into something timeless. Over time, the hangar drew attention beyond the town. Regional papers ran stories, and soon journalists came with cameras, capturing images of Emily standing beside the warbird. They called it the Legacy Hangar, a place where history wasn't locked in textbooks, but lived in steel and memory. Offers poured in. Universities wanted to collaborate. Aviation museums offered funding, and veterans groups pledged support. Emily accepted help, but guarded Green's vision fiercely. The hangar would never become a corporate exhibit. It would remain what it had always been, a place built on trust, grit, and love of legacy. One evening, as winter winds howled outside, Emily sat alone in the cockpit. Snowflakes tapped gently against the canopy. She thought back to the beginning, the mockery, the loneliness, the doubts that nearly crushed her. She remembered the day she found the warbird under its tarps, the first time she felt Green's presence guiding her. She remembered the night she promised him she would finish it, even when it felt impossible. And now, here she was, not only having flown the plane, but preserving its story for generations. Her heart swelled with gratitude for Green, for Walter, and Frank and Clara, for the teenagers who swept floors and polished panels, for the entire community that had transformed from doubters into believers. Most of all, she felt gratitude for the warbird itself, a machine that had carried not just men through the skies, but memories through time. Years later, when visitors asked Emily why she had done it, why she had taken on a task so immense when the world laughed at her, she always answered the same way. "Because someone believed in me, and because some dreams are too important to let die." She never mentioned the laughter, or the sleepless nights, or the weight of doubt. Those things had shaped her, yes, but they no longer defined her. What defined her now was legacy. On the anniversary of the first flight, the town gathered at the hangar once again. The Warbird's engine roared to life, its wings lifting into the sky as Emily piloted in wide arcs overhead. Children cheered, veterans saluted, and families held each other close. As she soared above them, Emily felt the same exhilaration. As that very first day, the wind rushing, the engine thundering, the horizon stretching boundless before her. And once again, she felt Green beside her, silent but proud. When she landed and stepped out to greet the waiting crowd, she knew the truth. Green's legacy was no longer his alone. It belonged to all of them. It belonged to the future. And as long as the Warbird soared, the laughter of doubters would remain just that echoes lost in the wind, silenced by the roar of a dream fulfilled.